much better than that could it get? So I want to tell you a quick story before I get into the material that's behind me. First of all, a little bit about my background. I think I've got the coolest job I've ever had because I get to go to these incredible places, and I've done 2 books in the last 4 years. I'm working on a couple of more now. And the book I did in 2011 was on temperate rainforests of the world. So you have to invite me back to that one.
Sure, no problem.
And this one is on dry forest and fire. So I've been able to span the whole gamut of forest types globally and have been to some of the most cool places on the globe from a forest ecology standpoint. In fact, I'm here in this region today because where we live, the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, when I was at World Wildlife Fund in 1998, when I was working on the book back then, this area was recognized as one of the top 10 temperate coniferous forests in the world. And I got a chance to move out here, open up an office for World Wildlife Fund at the time. Now I work for GEOS. I co-founded it in 2006. The mission of GEOS Institute is to lead the way on climate change solutions that matter. So a lot of the work that we do is focused on climate change. Jessica Leonard is here from our staff. She knows a lot about computers, GIS analysis, landscape analysis. There's a whole bunch of materials on the side. We're hawking books. Don't let me walk away with all those books in the corner. If you go on Amazon.com, those books cost $84. There's 450 pages in it, so there's a lot of material. If you buy it here, it's $20, greatly discounted. And there's only a few left because we've been giving them out, selling them at different events. I also would encourage you to take a look at the materials if you have time before the band comes on the desk over there, or the table over there. There's a whole bunch of materials. There's a fact sheet on fire that's free. There's a DVD video on the Klamath region that was narrated by Susan Sarandon that I worked on a few years ago at PBS about how great this place is that we live in. That's on sale as well. So we've got products, stuff that keep you busy if you're interested. There's a sign-up sheet if you want to get involved with GEOS. But I'm here today mostly to talk about forest fires because they're in the news all the time. And all we see is the disaster, the human tragedy around forest fires, but there's something else going on behind the scenes that I'd like to share with you. And so what led to this book was back in, I think it was a few years ago, when my daughter was 8. She's almost 11 now. So we took a hike up to Grizzly Peak. How many of you have been up to Grizzly Peak? Yeah, just about everybody. And I got up to the top, and the whole area, as you know, has been burned by a big fire that was up there. It was about a 2,000 acre fire in 2002, mostly high severity burn. My daughter kept saying, wow, this is really neat. Look at all the butterflies, look at all the wildflowers, look at all the birds. Man, this place is just alive with dragonflies. I started thinking about it, and the book popped into my head. And what inspired me was if an 8-year-old can see beauty in what other people see as destruction, maybe there's hope for a member of Congress. Well, I don't know, there's a big leap there going from an 8-year-old to a member of Congress, but that's why I did the book. And I started the project. The previous book I did on rainforest took me 18 months. I had a lot of help. There were a lot of other scientists involved in these books. It's not just me. This one was done in 6 months, which was really high-speed production because we were trying to get it out in the midst of fire season so that we could tell a different story. And that's what you're going to be hearing about tonight. So consequently, last week, I took a film crew up to the East Antelope fire on Grizzly Peak. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen. They had a drone camera, so this drone was above us the whole time, filming while we were walking into the fire area and getting a bird's eye view, literally. This drone was flying around. It sounded like a bee. I thought it was stepping on a wasp nest or something. This thing was going around and filming us, and it was really cool. It'll be on Southern Oregon Public Television, probably some clips coming out at the end of the month, I think, and then next year. So you're going to see some of this if you're on PBS someday. You'll see it on TV as well. So this book really inspired me to look at dry forest after doing the rainforest book because it's in the news all the time. So what you're going to see is some of the science and the ecology and how we can coexist with these forest fires that aren't going away. There's no way we're going to get rid of forest fires totally. So what's going on behind the scenes? Okay, bear with me. Okay, so we set out to answer a couple of basic questions in this book, and we tried to make it as accessible as possible. The preface is really good. There's some poetry in the preface. We talk about nature's phoenix, and I kept thinking about, okay, what's the symbol that we could use to tell this story? Because there's been so much negative symbology. If you go back in the 1940s, there was a lot of fear that the Germans and the Japanese were going to come over, bomb the forest, and set them on fire. So this is going back a long way. Smokey Bear is another symbol that's been used by the Forest Service to get people aware of putting out their forest fires. So what kind of symbol? And what popped into my mind was the phoenix, because literally that's what happens after these burns. The forest just comes right up out of the ashes. So we've tried to change the conversation symbolically about what happens. Not the human disaster, that's a real problem, and we can talk about coexistence. But what happens ecologically is just like a phoenix, it rises out of the ashes. So we wanted to take a look at, are these fires eco-disasters or something else? Are they increasing? You hear this all the time, worst fire season in history. Oh my God, we never had fires like this before. Well, we're gonna take a look at that question, see what you think about what the data say. And how do we get to coexistence? There's a lot of people now living in fire-prone areas. 46 million homes, the last count, that live in places that are prone to burn. And how do we coexist? Because the people aren't going away and the fires aren't going away. So is coexistence possible? We are not on a path of coexistence currently, but we can be there if we do things differently. I had to get a dinosaur slide in there. This just always got to have dinosaurs in your talks to keep people interested. So fire is not something new. It's been shaping the ecology. It's been the architect of vegetation communities going back as far as when there were plants in the world. So over 400 million years ago, the fires were shaping the ecology of place, just like they do in our region. So nature has adapted to periodic fire disturbances, and you'll see that shortly. And Indian people used fire quite a bit, the extent of which is debated by anthropologists and Native Americans alike, but they did use fire culturally to manage game species, culturally important species, mostly in low elevation areas, so that they were also co-fire architects. And fire is no stranger to this region. You heard the trivia before, but if you put it on a map, you can see all of those polygons, that we call them, from 1984 to 2014. Those are all the areas that are burned. They haven't burned uniformly, as you will see, but those are places that have been influenced by fire since 1984. So at least for the last 3 or 4 decades, we have been getting lots of fires in our area. We're used to it, kind of. So what the book was trying to do was to get a shift happening in the way we think about fire. If you look at the psychology of communication, when people think out of fear, it's the reptilian brainstem that's really working on how people react. That's what fire triggers in people. Oh my God, get out of the way. Oh my God, we got to stop the fire. It's very reptilian. What we're trying to do is push that out into the cerebral cortex and get people to think about this. When homes aren't burning, to get it out of that fear center, what's going on ecologically? And so the book gets through the latest science on the remarkable web of life, the circle of life that happens after a forest fire. We wanted to document nature's phoenix globally. It's not just Western North America. We cover Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Australia, Central Europe, Canada, places that have big fires in forests. Also, we took a look at chaparral in Southern California. You hear a lot about the Santa Ana winds right now. We also have a chapter on chaparral and forest fires. And a lot of scientists were involved in this project, and I surround myself by people that are smarter than me. That's what I do with all my projects, so a lot of folks were involved in helping me put this book together. I was just the glue. So a couple of things to point out, and I don't know how that's coming out on the monitors, but it's kind of dark up here, so bear with me. In fire ecology, we describe forest fires based on intensity and severity. And so intensity, you think of the heat of the fire, the physics of the heat of a fire. It can either be low and not very hot, although if you put your finger in it, of course it's going to be hot, or it could really be searing, which is on the bottom, and everything in between. So that's intensity, and intensity influences what happens to the vegetation. That's severity. And either you get hardly any tree kill, we're talking about tree kill here, that's a low severity fire.
Aerial shot?
This is, yeah, an aerial shot. Or you get very high severity where you have all the trees are killed by the fire, and everything happens in between. So it's a big gradient. It's not black and white. It's not a binary system. It is a gradient of severity, and that's really cool in nature. So you get this. This is the Biscuit fire in 2010, or 12 rather, 10 years after the fire. When I see this as an ecologist, I get excited. Variety, spice of life in nature. When you've got that kind of variability, that's when you get all kinds of critters, whether they like fire or they don't like fire, coming into the area. So these areas are as biodiverse as the more heralded old-growth forests, but they're underappreciated because most people think these are moonscapes after a fire. So again, this is 10 years after the burn, and nature takes a while to recalibrate itself, but when it comes back, in this kind of pattern, it's full of life. And this is what my daughter was saying. And so these forests are born to burn. A dry forest has to burn to maintain its ecological health. And there are lots of adaptations that these forests have to fire, as we point out in the book. So the big tree in the middle, obviously, is a coastal redwood and a huge fire scar. How many people, when they've been hiking in the woods, have seen big fire scars on trees? Yeah. You see them on the big old trees, right? You don't see them on those little tiny trees. You see them on the big old trees because it takes at least a century for them to build up this very thick bark, which is kind of like a natural asbestos. When a fire hits, they can withstand a lot of these forest fires. The giant sequoia, how many people have been hiking in the giant sequoia? Most fire-resistant conifer in the world. It can resist fires all the way up to its crowns. And then, of course, they have that huge bark that insulates it from a forest fire. So here's a really cool thing. You see that one on the left there, that big tall tree? The Forest Service said that was dead after the rim fire in 2013. They went in and they assessed the area in the fall. We went back in the spring and it was full of green needles that were starting to come back. It was a big surprise. It hasn't really been documented in too many studies, but it kind of reminds me of the Monty Python movie, I'm Not Dead Yet. And the tree was not dead. And it's important because they were classifying the burn based on the severity of tree kill, and they did it prematurely, and then they came in and salvage logged the dead trees, but the tree wasn't dead. It was still alive because it was born to burn, and it could resist forest fires. This is a ponderosa pine. And then you've got all kinds of mechanisms, seed cones that only burst out open when they're intensely heated, like lodgepole pine. It's got a serotinous cone, and it won't open those cones until it gets intense heat and it pops open. So nature was born to burn. These forests can handle a forest fire. So here are two images, one on my right and one on the left. And if you took a walk into the forest on the right, you would think, wow, really cool forest. That's my rainforest book. If you take a walk through the forest on the left, that's really cool too. That's my Tri-Forest book. And in fact, in these forests, the dead trees are more valuable than the living trees. Circle of life. What happens in these forests is all connected. What happens to the forest that's dead affects the forest that comes back. There's coexistence there, at least ecologically, because those big trees are going to give you the shade for their progeny to come back. Those big trees are anchoring the soil, and they're part of the succession of events that happen after a forest fire. You can't get a forest without the dead in a forest. The zombie trees are really important. And what we see in these forests after a burn, it really depends on when you come back. If you come back in the fall, oh my God, it looks so bad. But if you wait a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it's just full of life. You've got wildflowers. Best places to get morels are in these burn areas. You've got all kinds of insects. You've got all kinds of birds. The place is just jumping. If we just take the time to let nature tell us what's going on instead of what we think is going on. They're not moonscapes. So here's a really cool beetle. It's called a Melanophila beetle, the one on the top there. And a zoom in on one of its thoracic pores using an electron microscope. Those little pores there are heat receptors. And that beetle can detect a forest fire up to 40 kilometers away with those receptors, because it goes into the burn, into those dead trees, and that's food. And in turn, that food is a food source for blackback woodpeckers. And notice the coloration on the bird that you see on the screen. It matches, it's cryptically colored with the charred tree. And blackback woodpeckers are the bellwether species for burned areas. They only stay in those burned forests for about 4 or 5 years, and then they move on to the next burn. It's because their food source is there, their nesting source is there, and they're cryptically colored. These species are adapted to coexist with fire. Hold it until the end, okay? And then I'll take all the questions. So, when you look at this slide here, you're normally going to go to the reptilian stem and say, which is more important? Okay, it's the green forest. And because I've done books in both green and black, and it caused me to just change my whole perspective. Because both are important, and both are connected. And you can't have one without the other. And when the rim fire down by Yosemite was proposed for massive post-fire logging by the Forest Service, over 250 scientists weighed in and said, this is the most important, some of the rarest, most important forest habitat that's out there. Because normally it gets salvage logged and it's gone. Blackback woodpeckers cannot handle that. Lots of other critters can't. So again, both are important, living and dead forests. So here's the other question that comes to mind. Are forest fires increasing? Most people just look at this side of the curve, from 1970 up. Yeah, looks like it. Oh my God, worst fire in recorded history. And recorded history is 1970 or 1980 up. They forget what's going on the left side of the graph. And they don't take a look at the paleo records that go back before European contact. And they don't take a look at how fire cycles really are like a sine wave. They go up and they go down depending on what the climate is doing. So in the 1910s to 30s, there was a dry cycle. How many of you heard about the big burn in Montana? Yeah, there's a really good book by Timothy Egan out that describes that big burn. It was huge. It was a dry cycle in the early part of the century that were burning lots of acres. Native American people saw 10 to 30 million acres per year burning. If you go back in the paleo record, even further back when the climate was warmer, millions of acres were burning. So when I hear 9 million acres burned in the West in 11 states, worst fire history in first fire season on record, not so. It might be bad for humans, certainly, but it's not the worst fire season in terms of acres burned when you go far enough back in time. So it's really important to take a look at a longer period. And there's the 1910 big burn in Montana. You can see that it was huge, and it wiped out a bunch of towns, unfortunately. The other question we get are, okay, so acres aren't any different now, or not increasing now compared to historical times, but what about severity? Are fires getting more severe? There was a paper that came out just this year that looked at the most severe fires. And what they found was no pattern, which is what you see down at the bottom. Looking back as far as they could go in the data sets, 1984 forward, you don't see a pattern. We don't have good data sets beyond that in terms of classifying fire severity, other than some other techniques that I won't go into. Okay, so we're going to take a look at fire policy before, during, and after fire. So before fire, does thinning work to slow down a fire or stop fire or reduce fire intensity? Well, maybe. So there are some limits that you need to be aware of. So thinning works, but not during extreme weather events. So drought, high winds, high temperatures, the Biscuit Fire, burned under each of those conditions, went right through thin stand, went through Jeffrey Pine savanna, which is a real open forest condition, and burned in mixed severity, the way nature intended it to, but thinning had no effect on that fire. Too much thinning, if you open up the tree canopies too much, you take out too many trees, you actually can increase fire risks. And that's because you get more sunlight coming in, the vegetation grows up, and you have more fuels, and you get greater wind penetrance that goes through the forest. When the fires burn, you can actually go up to the tree crowns quicker because of wind penetrance if you thin too heavily. And it doesn't last long. In our region, it kind of comes back in 10 years. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep going back to the same place over and over again. And if you do it without a commercial component, if you're not taking the big trees, how do you pay for it? It could be really expensive if you do it right. Now, I'm not saying don't thin, but the chances of a lightning strike hitting the locations that you thinned based on computer simulation models is very low, about a 5% chance that the thin site will encounter a fire when the fuels are at their lowest level within 10 years. The chances that a thin site will encounter a severe fire, 2%, based on simulation models. Now, I'm not trashing thinning, I just want to make sure that we don't oversell it, because it has limitations. And we'll talk about where to apply thinning most effectively. Okay, so let's switch now to during fire. A lot of good work firefighters are doing out there. This is not a criticism of any firefighter's work. However, does it work all the time? Well, it works only if the weather cooperates. And 97% or 98% of all forest fires are put out. It's the 2% that are responsible for 97% of the burn acres annually. So why is that? Well, they escape containment during extreme weather events. High winds, drought, high temperatures. Guess what we're heading for? And the costs are skyrocketing. The top line graph there shows what the Forest Service and the Department of Interior is expending in fire suppression costs, nearly $5 billion to put out every single fire, even though they can't put out every single fire. So this has led a bunch of folks, even in Congress, to say, hey, wait a second, we need more transparent accounting. We got to figure out, is there a rational way to let some of these fires burn under safe conditions? How can we manage wildfire for the ecosystem benefits and reduce costs, and also have safe communities. We'll get to that in a minute. After fire, this is the Biscuit burn in 2002. The red that you see there is high severity. Before anybody actually went out and field checked this, the numbers, the percentages came down. Same kind of situation. Some of those trees really weren't dead, but it had a lot of high severity fire in it. So at the time, Senator Smith, remember Gordon Smith? Oh my God. He said, oh, the Biscuit is a moonscape. It'll never come back. Oh, the forests need to be planted and salvage logged, otherwise we will never have a forest again. I went out there in 2002, right after it was logged. On the left there, that's a late successional reserve that's supposed to be managed for all kinds of wildlife under the Northwest Forest Plan. It was salvage logged. It's almost the identical spot. 10 years later, hardly any conifer regeneration on that site. A little bit upslope in an unlogged botanical area with all those snags, those dead trees, biological legacies in place. Look at the conifer regen. Why is that? Well, there were a number of studies that were done. Soils were damaged in the logging, conifers were killed, dragging logs upslope. The natural regeneration that was happening was being killed by the Forest Service that was wanting to plant trees. And the interesting thing about it is the tree densities the Forest Service was planting at were lower than what nature was restoring to the forest. So there was actually more regeneration happening in the unlogged areas compared to the tree planted areas. So these forests come back, and there have been a number of studies. This is not the only one. So I'm going to fast forward a bit and talk a little bit about the Douglas Fire Complex that happened in 2014, just outside of Grants Pass. You can't really see this too well, but it's a heavily fragmented system. I heard a lot of county commissioners complaining, we can't get in there, we can't log, there's too many environmental restrictions. You look at that landscape, I'm not seeing a lot of environmental restrictions in that landscape. We overlaid the fire severity types on that landscape after the fire. Most of the severe burns happened in the tree plantations, which is what you would expect because the trees are really compact, they're small, they burn like kindling. Same thing happened east of Green Springs last year. The fire blew up when it hit slash piles that were up about 14 feet high in the plantations. We know in our region, plantations burn uncharacteristically severe. Same thing we're seeing in California as well. And you know, this is what it looks like on private lands. This is what post-fire logging does, which is a lot worse than the ecosystem benefits we're getting out of fire. And the reason is because they take out those big trees that are the next forests and they replace them with slash piles and damaged soils. And the slash piles burn up in the next fire event. So what do we do about this? How do we get to coexistence? So this is the last couple of slides of the talk. And coexistence, you need to get, well, first of all, when I go back to DC, which I do frequently, I was just there a couple of weeks ago handing out books and all kinds of information to members of Congress that are considering legislation. The legislation passed in the House that would suspend most of the environmental laws on national forests so they can get in and do salvage logging, post-fire logging, over huge landscapes. They're talking about post-fire logging without any environmental review over 15,000 acre units. Whether it's been damaged by fire or insects, they can go in and just do what you've seen there. So we're passing out the letters from scientists and the books, and we talked about coexistence. Senator Cantwell is actually working on a really interesting bill that's aimed at homeowners and helping homeowners. So and I think it's a good idea. So what we think needs to happen here is in the backcountry, roadless areas, wilderness areas, under safe conditions. It's not an exact science, but you can use a certain set of predictors to determine when to manage fire for wildfire benefits, when you can have minimal invasive suppression tactics. That's up in the upper left. The Homeland Fire Security slide, we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's where you pull out all the stops. Got to help people, got to defend that space around homes, make sure the homes don't burn down, people's lives don't burn up in a fire. Out in the plantations, down in the low elevations, you can do thinning and prescribed fire, but keep in mind the limitations. It is not a panacea, especially as the climate shifts increasingly to extreme weather events. It will override whatever we do on the ground with fuels. So we have to solve for climate change. Okay, this slide here is my watershed using Google Image. You can see this better in the book. We're calling these fire sheds. I really like the Homeland Fire Security thing. You know, everything's Homeland Security now. You always have to kind of align it with what people are thinking. So it's the same thing with forest fires. We can live safely. And this is my watershed. My house is in the middle of that. And who got the 100 to 200 feet right in the Trivia Pursuit question? You got it. So if you do that, the chance of your home surviving a forest fire increases to over 90%. The insurance companies know this too. Insurance companies are pulling out of Southern California. They're not insuring new homes in Southern California because they know this too. And what you do in that 100 to 200 foot radius can determine whether or not your home and possibly you survive. And first of all, you don't build with wooden structures or wooden roofs or wooden siding. So you go to metal. You screen your openings from any ambers coming in. A lot of fires in homes are started by ambers that come into different openings and start a fire. So you screen those. You reduce the vegetation around the house, 100 to 200 feet, at least down to less than 40% plant cover, and you don't plant with flammables. And you don't have any wood around your house, like wood piles for firewood, that sort of stuff. What happens in the backcountry does not affect that statistic at all. This is based on multiple studies. Even the insurance companies have looked at this and have reached the same conclusion. So coexistence begins by homeowner responsibility, and it has to happen pretty fast because the sprawl that's happening in Western communities today is mind-boggling, and it's only going to increase those fire suppression costs and put more lives at risk. And so one of the things that I would like to encourage our local decision makers to think about is to not be so against land use zoning. Because the more homes that are built into that fire shed, the more people and the higher the costs that are at risk. So we can do stuff to manage our risks. Okay, so conclusions of the book. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're in a rainforest, then you've got to have rain. If you're in a dry forest, the ecological health of that forest is dependent on periodic forest fires, usually of mixed severity, as we've talked about, because that's the variety that we see in these fires and in nature. And fire policy needs an overhaul, and this is when I go back to DC and I talk to members of Congress about, there are ways to coexist. There's Homeland Fire Security, there's ways to reduce the risk to firefighters and also lower the cost. We don't have to fight every single fire. We can be more smart about it. Fire and climate change are linked events. If only you solve for fire, you're only working on the symptom and not the cause. We've got to solve for climate change, which means reducing fossil fuel emissions and deforestation. Those are the two biggest contributors to global warming. And unless we solve for that on a global scale and on a local scale, we're going to see an increase in fires, more extreme fire events, because in our region, we're seeing more droughts, we're seeing higher temperatures, and that's what's going to affect fire more than fuels. And the post-fire logging is the real ecological disaster. That's what really affects these forests and their ability to rejuvenate themselves after a forest fire. And finally, if you're interested in getting involved, there's our website. There's fact sheets on the where Jessica is sitting, and the book is on sale, and I'd be happy to take questions now. Yes?
So my question earlier when you were talking about, is that a fire beetle? Is that what that one's called?
It's called a fire chaser.
Fire chaser.
Yeah, that's a really cool name for it, because that's exactly what it does. Yes?
Well, I was going to say that I went to the Ashland at Home meeting about disasters in Ashland,
Yeah.
and I'm considering about re-roofing my house, and I said, I'm going to get a metal roof, you know. And they go, no, you don't need that. No, the fires aren't going to come to town. But when at Ashland at Home, the disaster preparedness, they showed the spotting distance for wildland fire from the watershed.
Yeah.
It covered everything from the watershed down to the freeway.
Yeah.
Basically. So, you know, I mean, spotting distance is something that's really important, you know, for a fire.
Yeah, you're on the right track. Definitely do that. And I took my daughter to one of her friend's house today up on Ridge Road. And you know, she even said it to me. Again, this is my smart 11-year-old now, saying, oh, you know, how can these people live up here in this really flammable country? Oak and manzanita. Manzanita will just burn like that. It's got a waxy leaf material that when fire hits it, it's born to burn. And the cool thing about manzanita is that its seed source is below ground. And the seeds aren't activated until a fire comes through. So that's really cool for manzanita, but have people that are living up there with very dense vegetation around their houses. So I worry about that, and I hope this information gets out to people. There's a brochure that Jessica has here on the table on living safely with fire, what you could do in the interface. And you know, especially that slopey rise up the hill of fires, if they start down low, will just race right over that south-facing slope, and it could get ugly. So that's why I think what they're doing in the watershed with respect to working right around the homes is smart. Building with a metal roof is really smart. You'll be increasing your risk that your home will survive a forest fire if you do all those things by 90%. Yeah.
You talked about the biscuit fire. If I remember right, when that started, they had the idea that it was going to be kind of let it burn. And they didn't do anything for the first few weeks because it was in the wilderness. And they thought it would be okay. And then it ended up costing all this money.
Yeah.
What, did they do the right thing, or should they have done something different? Was the money well spent? I mean, I just got through walking through the whole biscuit fire area, so I saw what you're talking about, and I just wondered what you're feeling about that now, all these years later.
You know, the biscuit, I don't want to criticize the Forest Service or the firefighters because they, you know, usually make the right calls, especially when people's lives are at risk. And in the case of the biscuit, it happened on July 12th. It started as a series of lightning bolts during an extreme drought. And it burned over, I think it was a 9-day period, most of the biscuit burned. And it was associated with high winds and very high temperatures that July. I don't think they could have put it out. They did the best that they could. They used back burning, which also influenced the kind of fire burning patterns that happened. It's really hard to tease out what was natural and what was caused by the burn, back burn firefighters were using. Everybody know what a back burn is? If you don't, just let me know and I'll explain it. But anyway, they tried to just use a back burn that influenced fire behavior as well. And you know, it was red flag days. The winds were going really high. They had a no-win scenario on that one. And what eventually put that fire out were the fall rains in September. It wasn't the fire suppression activity, although I'm sure they had a lot to do with saving individual homes. There were some right in the path of the fire that were saved, but otherwise that fire was put out by the rain. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that my job was as a Type 1 fire use manager in Yosemite and in Alaska. And when you're managing fire in the backcountry, if you don't have top-notch, experienced people on the ground to tell you what's going on, and be really cognizant of the weather and stuff like that, these extreme fire events can just creep up on you. But you have to be constantly, there are plans that they go through, and maybe they didn't go through all the right plans, because I manage fires like that you have to have contingency plans for the fire gets away, and you should get weather information that tells you if it's gonna blow up, if it's gonna be a huge weather event. So maybe they didn't do that, and it is extremely difficult to manage fires, to accomplish what he's saying, to let the fire burn in the wilderness areas, quote unquote, and then all of a sudden there's a fire event, an event where the wind blows it into a managed area. But that should all be pre-planned for in the plans the Forest Service or any government agency has. They may not have had that, but it's extremely difficult. You have to like balance the value of fire, like he's talking about in the wilderness areas, and where the people live on the outside.
I guess part of my question was, is the money spent on these fires, is that money well spent? In other words, it costs a lot of money, but is that actually helping the health of the forest to an extent that it's kind of worth it to spend all this money there because we need to do this sooner or later?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me, before I forget, the other thing that happened on the Biscuit is that it was a very active fire season that year in the west. So fire crews were put in other areas, and there was a delayed response on the Biscuit, and they didn't actually start the full suppression until the fire really was erupting. So there's just so many resources that you could throw at these fires. And you know, like I mentioned in the statistics, 97% of them are put out. It's the 2 or 3% that escape containment. And those are the ones that, you know, we need to think about letting them burn, because it's just, you might as well just throw money out the plane window. You're not gonna put those fires out. And it becomes mostly a show, a force of, you know, air tankers over an area. And, you know, you've gotta aim it mostly at helping homeowners and protecting lives, but still, during those extreme events, you're not going to put out those big fires, and that's what accounts for most of the acres that are burned every year in the West. That's why I really like what Cantwell is doing. Cantwell is forcing the discussion about having transparent accountability standards. And I can't answer the question because it's really hard to get that information out of the Forest Service, because they basically get a blank check from Congress to fight any fire that happens. And so I think, you know, they've got a cohesive fire management strategy, the Forest Service does, but they seldom use it. And, you know, Forest Service has become the fire service, and they're bipolar with fire. They talk about being comprehensive about it and letting some fires burn under safe conditions, but when the fire season happens, they're out there with full suppression forces. Although, to the credit of the Rogues River Siskiyou National Forest, the Buckskin Fire, initially they sent the attack force on that, and then they pulled back.
Yeah.
And they pulled back because it was burning over the Biscuit area in a mixed severity pattern away from homes, and they pulled it back. So that was a smart decision in my view.
That's where I was. I saw the fire line about 5 miles from the fire. In other words, they had made the decision to build this fire line on the ridge between the Baldface Creek and the Chetco, and everything south of that they were going to let burn.
Yeah.
And the fire never reached them, never reached the fire line.
It's not an exact science by any means.
Yeah.
Way in the back and then up front.
So this is a little bit off the subject, but what I see is that there's a lot of money being given now for fuels reduction. And I'm assuming because of fear of fire. Do you think that there's, other than in the Louis area, that there's, what would you say is good reason for doing fuel reduction?
Yeah, great question. So I'm in the minority on this, but it's a growing minority, and it's based on research that's been done. And it's great that there are different collaborative projects that are out there, but you've got to also look at the data. And in our region, because our fires burn in a mixed severity pattern, mixed severity fires are primarily influenced by extreme weather events, are secondarily influenced by fuels. So if you've got drought, high winds, high temperatures, it's going to burn through thin and unthinned areas. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't thin, we just need to be more judicious about it. And so I think the interface is a good place for doing fuels reduction. How far out from the interface you go, the science starts to drop off. You don't save structures if that's what your goal is. If you want to lower fuels, you could do it in the flammable plantations and under average conditions. Maybe those areas burn in a mixed mosaics pattern, but under extreme conditions, it'll just treat it as kindling and it'll race right through. So, you know, if you were in the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona, in a ponderosa pine historical low severity system, where fuels have built up and those fire events are mostly driven by fuels, then it makes sense. But in mixed severity, in steep terrain, and under extreme weather conditions, you gotta take a look at those limitations and be judicious about it. Up front.
Yes, my question is about the needed policy change, and I'm wondering if you talked about in your book the cultural aspects of forests as agriculture. You know, they're managed by our Department of Agriculture, and then just the huge business of firefighting. I've worked as a river guide in the wild section when we were taking fires down there. We estimated there's probably $250,000 spent on rafting for that fire. And I saw the excess, and just I can can you speak to that in the book?
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
Well, it seems like if you're talking about major policy change,
Yeah.
you have to do with these cultural institutions of, you know, the forests are seen as a crop.
Right.
That changes the dynamic. And then firefighting as a business, huge business.
Yeah.
Those are huge barriers.
Yeah, chapter, I think 11 or 12, there's a great chapter in there by Timothy Inglesby, who started his own organization for firefighters and ecological ethics. And he's a former firefighter, and he wrote it from that perspective. He talks a lot about that issue, that it is a big business. It's a blank check, and without accountability standards and transparency in terms of when to fight and not fight fires, you're absolutely right. And so, yeah, that's a really good chapter in there written by a former firefighter. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
When you're talking about thinning and stuff, I was just wondering about thinning for increasing forest health, like say in the plantations or areas that haven't burned in a long time that normally did used to burn, and where the forest is just way too thick.
Yeah. So there's a lot
Not
of...
necessarily for fire, but for the health of the forest.
I think there's certainly ecological justification for thinning in plantations. They're really kind of biologically sterile. And you can accelerate the rate of growth of trees. If one of your goals is to get them older faster, you can thin and do that. And that's what the Northwest Forest Plan encourages. So I could see that. This is mostly for the wet forest, by the way. When you get in the dry forest, though, and you want to thin, you've got the same kind of rule sets that are working against you. You've got a system that is mostly driven by climate, secondarily by fuels, and you've got that probability problem. And so you can thin, but don't get overboard that it's going to save the day, because there are all those kinds of limitations in the area that we live in, especially if you're on steep slopes. Does that answer your question?
So, sort of.
Okay. You know, anything in science, you always have to say, well, yeah, but it depends.
Yeah.
So, depends. All right.
So I have another question just about your last thing about the climate change thing. I just spent 2 days at the SOCAN conference. So what can we do as citizens to encourage this sea change?
Okay.
Way quicker.
Everybody hear that. So how do we solve for climate change? I have my own answer, but I want to hear from other people. What are you guys doing to address climate change?
Conservation.
Conservation. What else?
Conservation.
What else?
Getting an electric car.
Electric car. Cool. Got to get our fossil fuel consumption down.
Way down.
And it's got to really come down. I mean, we're talking about, we're lucky if we keep the global temperature at 2 degrees centigrade, and 2 degrees centigrade is going to be a big impact. The further away from 2 degrees it gets, the more catastrophic it becomes for the next generation. And it's unfortunate that we're not getting the kind of moonshot leadership to make that happen. Although Obama's been doing some really interesting stuff, he's got the U.S. Congress that's kind of tugging on his ability to do even more. But we're going to have to do some really big things, policy-wise and locally, if we're going to solve for this. And there's a whole bunch of websites that you can jump on ecological footprint. There's an ecological footprint calculator that you could just get on the web and you can reduce your own carbon footprint. And the other thing we can do is protect our forests. Forests are great at storing carbon. They're like a big sponge of carbon. Those big trees are just a big stick of carbon out there that has been soaking up carbon, atmospheric carbon now for centuries. So the more we cut those trees down, the more of that carbon escapes into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. So by having smart forest policies that protect older forests, we can make a contribution, at least in our BLM and Forest Service lands here. Yeah.
And the carbon sequestration is true for the standing dead trees too, isn't it?
Not sequestration, but storage. Because you have to be alive to sequester carbon, right? Because that's what plants are doing. They're taking carbon in, photosynthesis, remember that? And they're making food and they're storing the excess as the trunk of the tree, the roots of the tree. So it's both sequestration, which is absorbing the carbon, and carbon storage, which is what you see in front of you. So when a tree dies, it's not sequestering anymore, but it still has that carbon bank, that reservoir of carbon, and it's really good at holding on to it because it's eventually going to die, topple over, and decompose and give up its carbon, but that could take over a century while the new vegetation's coming up. Okay, well, thank you so much. Books are over here, sign up sheets. Thanks again for ScienceWorks.